These tubes have connected. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Joshua Gilliland, and I'm one of the founding attorneys of the Legal Geeks. And if you are like me, you absolutely nerded out over the Falcon and the Winter Soldier premiere of A New World Order. With me tonight to discuss all the great legal issues is a lawyer extremely well known in the world of national defense and espionage, and that is Mark Zaid. Mark, how are you this evening?
Hey, I'm good, Josh. It's great to be here with you. Thanks for the invite.
This has been a long time. Admired your work for a long time, all those wacky times you make news. So it's lovely to actually get to chat with you about something we both love. And in this case, it's comics, and specifically Falcon and the Winter Soldier. What did you think of the episode?
I enjoyed it a lot. You know, I will say I enjoyed it more than WandaVision, because at first you're like, what the heck are they doing in WandaVision, which grew on me as time went by. But watching Falcon and the Winter Soldier was like watching a Marvel Universe movie, just in TV format. So it felt good. It was fluid. It was what we expected, which is probably why it just was more comfortable for people than perhaps WandaVision was at first.
Yeah, I enjoyed both, but for different reasons. There were friends of mine whose reaction to WandaVision after the first episode was, "What did I just watch?" And my reaction was like, "It's a comic. Be cool. Give it time. I understand instant gratification with other streaming shows, but give it time." And I enjoyed that. And that's a different discussion. The fact that it opens with a very traditional Marvel action story, and there are a ton of legal issues that we both identified to talk about just with the opening. And then it turns into a beautiful character study with what's happened with Bucky and Sam post-blip. And we also start learning about the world, which again opened legal issues for us to geek out about. So again, it was, the music very similar to the Winter Soldier movie. And I just love a good spy story. So again, it worked for me.
I'm good. Looking forward to the next one for sure.
Oh, absolutely. So let's talk about the New World Order. We open up with, it appears that Falcon has been a government contractor for the U.S. Air Force, and we have a C-130 that gets hijacked by a group known as LAF. And this is interesting because, like, we just jump into the action. Again, similar to the Winter Soldier movie with the Loranian star, it's just get up and go. And they don't explain how the plane was hijacked, why the captain on board was important. So like there's a bunch of unknowns there. But we have some very meaty legal issues that we both put together in our outline. And let's take those apart. So we got kidnapping of an Air Force officer. He gets beat up. We have a pilot, at least one pilot killed. And they're very concerned about crossing into Libyan airspace. From a foreign policy and legal perspective with international law, why would they be concerned?
Yeah, there were a number of things that were jumping in my mind while first watching it. And then, of course, even more so as we've been discussing it, trying to dissect it from a legal standpoint. First thing I'm trying to figure out is I represent a lot of military pilots over the years. And for anyone who's in the military now, if you were in the military 15, 20 years ago and you were able to avoid the anthrax vaccination, that was because of the work we were doing in trying to shut down the program. So I had C-130 pilot clients. That is a huge plane. So the first thing I'm thinking of is, okay, there's one known dead pilot and one captain who's been taken hostage. Where's everybody else, for one thing? And Tunisia, which is in North Africa, for probably most people don't know where Tunisia is. North Africa, nearby to Libya, obviously. Libya, Egypt, Morocco, that whole region And like, where did the C-130 come from? Probably Incirlik Air Force Base, which is a U.S. NATO base in Turkey. But, we don't know any of that. So the first thing is they're so concerned about going into Libyan airspace. Look, anytime when any country, you obviously, we have borders, and you can't violate those borders by going into their country without authorization, or you are subject to the laws of that particular country. Now, Libya is a very meaningful country to me that I've dealt with throughout my 30-year legal career, because I sued the government of Libya when Gaddafi was in power for the bombing of Pan Am 103. And I'm now suing the warlord Khalifa Hifter, who is trying to undertake a coup to overthrow the legitimate, recognized government of Libya. So they're concerned, of course, in the segment about going into Libya because we're going to violate their sovereignty. And what could happen? Well, Libya could construe that as an act of war, and that would be subject to defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. But at the same time, I'm thinking, well, the one character who's given Sam guidance is like, look, Sam, we cannot have the military doing any operations here. Yet they've got a first lieutenant, who we'll talk more about, riding in his Jeep in Tunisia. So do we have authorization to be in Tunisia? Now, it turns out we do have a military presence in Tunisia. Tunisia has been very important for the United States because of fighting in Al-Qaeda, with Al-Qaeda, and also because of what's going on in Libya with the civil unrest. But it's really unclear as to what our military presence is in Libya, and in Tunisia, and whether they've already violated the sovereignty of Tunisia. There's all the, of course, like anything with the Marvel universe and comic book world, there's far more questions than answers.
Yeah, and it's great. I mean, granted, the action scene is beautiful, practical. So there are a lot of practical effects. The stuff that's CGI or done on the soundstage, it's really hard to tell what's what in that regard. So that's cool. Like the Roger Moore era James Bond movies where they, we're going to jump the car and have it do a flip. Like, it's like, let's actually do this. Put on the wingsuit and jump out of the airplane. And like that, again, just as an action fan, that's cool. It's also fascinating to go like, hey, that was your case. That's a unique experience to be having right now, to realize matters that you worked on is fascinating. And it just, again, just neat. Now I know you can expand upon this because of your involvement, but the idea of suing Libya. So we have some, helicopter gunships that are at play, and the LAF terrorists, they're French. It's hard to tell if the helicopters are Libyan or if they are non-state actors, like they bought them from a defense contractor or black market. Clearly well-armed and well-financed. But if they are trying to get to Libya and the Libyan government somehow involved in this kidnapping of a U.S. soldier, and we have at least one dead Air Force pilot, we get into the issue of suing that country. And normally we have the issue of foreign sovereignty, and you can't just go out and sue another country unless they did something. And with the idea that if Libya is a state actor, we have laws that allow us to sue a country that has targeted U.S. soldiers, and thus giving the cause of action for surviving family members to sue that nation. You've had a hand in this. Can you expand upon the rights that the family of the slain Air Force pilot would have?
Yeah, sure. So Batrak, or however one wants to pronounce his name, as you said, he's a French mercenary. So, of course, we don't know who he's working for in this. And even though they are clearly in their, I think there were 3 helicopters at least at one point,
Yes.
trying to fly into Libyan airspace. They don't care, of course, if they're violating any laws or not. So they may be working for Libya, or they're just going into Libya for a hideout, maybe because they know the U.S. won't follow them, which it seemed to be that's what they suspected would occur for whatever particular reason. And I mean, that's a realistic situation because, back in 2012, we had our ambassador to Libya murdered in Benghazi, Libya, as well as 3 other Americans. And I represented half a dozen CIA officers who were in Benghazi that day in dealing with that incident. And it became very politically partisan. And the issue that came up to everybody's mind was, well, why didn't we send a U.S. gunship into Benghazi when we knew our State Department compound was under attack? And that always blew my mind because I'm like, people, it's Libyan sovereignty. You don't just send in U.S. warships, gunships into a foreign country without permission. But in this case, when you're talking about suing Libya, so states have sovereign immunity by their very nature. That is the agreed upon custom internationally. And for the most part, any sovereign can do whatever it wanted. And then when commercial activities, businesses, countries started doing more business, there was an exception. But we carved out, I helped draft the language 30 years ago to ensure that Americans could sue those countries that were designated as terrorists. And this was for the Pan Am 103 Lockerbie families. And Libya, of course, was the primary culprit that we wanted to sue. So if this had happened a bunch of years ago, there could have potentially been a lawsuit against Libya. But during the last Bush administration, Libya was removed from the terrorist list by the State Department. So there would no longer be an exception because the event happened. Technically, it happened in Tunisia. But let's say there was command responsibility by the Libyan government, depending on which Libyan government was doing this. There would be sovereign immunity to sue them. I mean, we could even throw in another issue of whether or not an active duty military officer could sue. Though there was a bombing in Germany, Labelle Disco bombing in 1986 that Gaddafi was responsible for. And the victims, who were mostly American military, did sue Libya. And ultimately there was a settlement, but they had sovereign immunity issues. So it gets very complicated.
And it's, again, fascinating to think about the news and what you were involved with that I've paid attention to over the decades. That's just thank you for all that you did. Yeah, there's some rich issues here on, did LAF commandeer, hijack the plane on the ground from a military base? That makes the most sense for how they got on board, because an aerial boarding seems unlikely from the tech that we see them have. So it's, again, how do they, the how is fascinating to think about, but I'm completely fine jumping into a story midpoint, because that's what happens in comic book stories all the time, and especially Captain America type stories where it's just, we begin with him parachuting. Here we go. And I'm completely fine with that. But again, it's rich issues.
Right, because if they had done it on the ground, because you're right, from their technological standpoint, it doesn't look like they would have been able to gain entry from once in flight. But if they took it on the ground, then why did they need to keep the pilot there, or anybody else? So, because obviously they were piloting the plane. So it's very likely to avoid the need to explain that. That's why it started midair.
Yeah, because it's just like, really, there would have been a crew of 2. And if they did kill a bunch of crew members, we don't see the bodies unless they dump them.
Right. I mean, it's entirely possible. And I did not bother to check with clients as to whether or not, I imagine probably 2 people could fly a C-130. The likelihood that only a crew of 2 would be on a C-130 is another issue altogether. So it may very well be, although they didn't make any mention that there were, oh, we're concerned about the whole crew or anything like that. And then, the other legal issue, of course, that I identified is, once the shooting started and the terrorist pilot got shot and presumably killed, slumped over, the C-130 now is going down, and they all abandoned the plane. And the Falcon doesn't seem to care. So presumably there are no other crew members. His mission is to only get the one captain for, whatever reason, because that's not explained at all, obviously, who this captain is, why is he significant, why would they capture him, or anything of the sort. But now I'm thinking, all right, they just ditched the C-130. That's an expensive plane, by the way. That's a really expensive plane.
It's an expensive plane, and it's going to crash someplace.
Yeah. What if it crashed and it killed a bunch of goats that, some Tunisian or Libyan herder was walking along, very calmly, and the C-130 lands on them? Could they sue the United States for that type of act? Now, I'm not aware of a comparable situation, but I can come up with an example that I was well aware of, because it was always in my mind doing the Lockerbie bombing, and I am by no means comparing people to goats in this example. But in July of 1988, the USS Vincennes shot down an Iran Air Flight 655, and we killed 290 people. And accidentally, I hope, but that's what it was always said to be. And they sued in U.S. court against the United States. But the case was dismissed for, I believe, political question, doctrine issues, and I think there was sovereign immunity issues. Ultimately, the U.S. government settled for $250,000 per victim. So, there could have been, if such a situation happened where someone was hurt, or their property damaged as a result of the C-130 crashing, there is a history of the U.S. government at least working out some sort of compensation. Because, just think of Iraq and Afghanistan in the last 20 years. There's been lots of incidents of collateral damage to property and, unfortunately, sadly, human life. And we do work out compensation. So there would be a tort branch within the Air Force that would be dealing with all these types of claims.
It's similar to the tragic situation back in 2000, where a U.S. submarine doing a dependence cruise didn't check the surface, doing a periscope loop, and then sank a Japanese vessel. And
right.
Like that had serious repercussions because of, again, the captain screwed up in that matter. And again, he did resign, and he went to Japan and apologized, and the vessel was raised, and everyone had proper burials. But I'm sure there was financial compensation for that massive mistake.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember that. That was really tragic for everybody, obviously. Yeah. And then we think about, clearly Sam was killing people. The Falcon was killing people in the midst of this endeavor. Now, obviously they were trying to kill him, so there is matter of self-defense. It is unclear. You mentioned in the beginning, is presumably he's a contractor for the U.S. Air Force. Is there an actual contract? Who knows? That's unclear. And there'll be some scenes we talk about later where, what is his role and Bucky's? Are they agents of the U.S. government? Are they independent contractors or actual civil servants? Because it would make a difference to some extent on some of the legal issues. But, let's say that, if any of these folks got into Libya or survived into Tunisia, Batroc obviously survived. I'm sure we'll see him some later episode or series. Could the Libyans try to get anyone extradited, or could we try and get Batroc extradited? Well, we don't have an extradition treaty with either Libya or Tunisia. Tunisia basically will never extradite its nationals. Libya is a different story. And in fact, we're working right now I'm working for the Pan Am 103 families to get a suspect from the 1988 bombing extradited to the United States. Now, I say extradited, it's really surrendered in my opinion, because we don't have an extradition treaty with Libya. But then there are exceptions to extradition treaties, like with respect to political offenses and military actions. And, if Libya had said, well, we want Sam, the Falcon, extradited, the U.S. government has the option under international law to prosecute Sam first under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, if in fact that applies to him as a contractor, which if he is a contractor, doesn't. But otherwise, the federal criminal justice system could handle it.
And it's, I haven't done the research on the government or our military using contractors to fight. I know it's happened, but it raises interesting question of law of war on rules of engagement, and what's their status under the Geneva Convention. And again, that could be a podcast unto itself, but it's just to acknowledge that's an issue with Sam's status as, we think, a contractor, and he's using lethal force on behalf of the U.S. government. And he's not, he's a former member of the military, but he's not a current member of the military from what we can tell. So.
Yeah. And actually there's I'm trying to think actually, of course, we do know this. He used to be in active duty military. We know that from one of the other Captain America films. When they first met, he talked about how he learned, he got the technology for the wings and everything when he was on active duty. And there's actually a case right now at the Armed Forces Court of Appeals to determine whether or not this has been practiced, that you can recall recall a retiree to active duty for prosecution, even though the act was committed while in your non-active duty retirement status. So that's a possibility, and they've been toying with it as to whether that could be, and we'll probably see a change perhaps in recent days. But going back to this contractor working for the U.S. government, again, so much of this does have real world implications. It may act out differently in the Marvel universe because it has to be television and movies, and it's got to be fluid. They don't want to be bothered by the nuances of law or sometimes even physics. But there oftentimes is a real world scenario that's somewhat related, and we can just point to what happened in Iraq with Blackwater, a defense contractor. It's called something else now, in part because of an incident that its people had in a square, I think in Baghdad, if I recall correctly, where they killed a number of civilians. And Iraq wanted to have them prosecuted, but the U.S. government instead brought them back they got back to the United States, and we prosecuted them here in the United States. And I believe some of their convictions got thrown out recently, if I'm recalling correctly, actually. I mean, it's a very controversial topic. But there is this connection between the contractors and U.S. government activities.
I remember the headline. I don't remember the details. But yeah, I remember the details of what they did, which was horrific, which is very different than the situation with the Falcon, which is very much a military operation, and he's on behalf of the U.S. military to rescue a airman who's been kidnapped. And we can do that. That's in our interest to save our people. So, and the gunships are clearly trying to kill him. So it does meet all of the requirements for, it's a form of self-defense, but it's the military equivalent that we've been attacked. We're trying to get one of our people back, and there's a fight because of it. So.
Yeah, and there's also a difference between, is it legal under U.S. law versus the host nation or wherever territory it is. So under U.S. law, pretty much everything that, at least that I saw superficially, that Sam and the U.S. government was engaged in was likely legal. it could have violated Tunisian law, it could have violated Libyan law, but years back in the when did we have? Oh gosh, I'm forgetting on the actual year. The end of the 80s, very early 90s, the U.S. government sent FBI and other agents into Mexico. We kidnapped a doctor, Alvarez Machain, who had alleged to have helped torture one of our DEA agents, Kiki Camarena, and Mexico. We did it without Mexican authorization. We went into Mexico. Bill Barr was actually the acting, I think, attorney general at the time, and did a legal memo, or at least did it under his name, because I remember he testified about it, to say that this was legal under U.S. law for us to send personnel into the foreign country. But if they got captured or arrested, they were subject to the local law. So if Sam had gotten caught in Libya, the Libyans would have been within their right to prosecute him.
It makes me think of all the Cold War spy stories, like with the intrigue and the complexity of what law applies. And it's just, I have a feeling we'll see more of these issues in the next 5 episodes. Did you spot any other issues before we get to what happens in Washington, D.C. That we should touch on for moving forward?
It's interesting. Sam at one point said, okay, if I do it this way, I think he said, like, swoop down, swoop back up, no trees will have violated. I think he was probably right on that, because I don't think we have any that I saw. We had any treaties between the countries that would have done anything. We have mutual legal assistance treaties with them, mostly for economic trade, and both countries are parties to multilateral treaties with the United States. There could have been something that applied, but it was a nice toss in by the writers to make a legal comment that they weren't violating any type of bilateral or multilateral treaties with either Tunisia or Libya.
It's nice to see an honest effort. There was one of the writers for Agent Carter. I saw him speak at Long Beach Comic-Con a few years ago. And I asked him if the fact that the series Agent Carter made more of an attempt to follow the Constitution, like there's references to actually following the Fourth Amendment to arrest someone, and they're accurate. And my question was that intentional compared to Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., which had zero interest in following our Constitution? And he said yes. Like that was an intentional move by them to try to keep it legal. And I can only guess, but my guess is these writers are trying to do a similar theme of the law matters, as opposed to throwing all caution to the wind when it comes to superhero activities that are sanctioned by the U.S. government. So.
These studios have been at it for a long time, and many of these programs in these studios have lawyers, current or former lawyers, or military law enforcement who they go to at least run scripts by and say, just make it not laughable. It doesn't have to be completely accurate. You can push the envelope, but just make it that it's not completely laughable. And most of the time, at least for me, when I watch these movies, these programs, I try to take the lawyer hat off. I just want to have the fandom hat on. I just want to enjoy it superficially. Don't try and dissect it. This is fun to obviously do, because this is what the intent of this is. But while I'm watching it, I'm not thinking about, he's going to violate Libyan sovereignty. That's not going to work.
I do, but that's probably why I'm home alone on a Saturday night. But that's just that's how I roll. It's that issue spotting is hard for me to turn off. But watching lawyer TV shows does give me high blood pressure. So I actually avoid those because what happens in them. But that's another discussion.
We can do another
things
podcast on
that
that.
cause me stress about inaccuracies about the practice of law. Well, let's talk about the Shield, and they do have these for sale. They are really nice, and God bless them. Yeah, this was that was some retail therapy I did after Christmas because, well, you know, the world's scary. And sometimes you just want to go buy a toy to make yourself feel better. And this was one of those. But we have Sam has Captain America's shield. And, you know, just for an overview of property, I want to walk through the fact pattern here. And we both worked on this. So starts with end of Endgame. Steve Rogers gives Sam Wilson the shield. Was that a valid gift? And that requires us to do some tracing. So Howard Stark in World War II, as a US government contractor, made and gave the shield to Steve Rogers. Howard Stark acquired the vibranium on his own. So but he was a government contractor at this point in time. Steve's on ice for 75 years. The events of Captain America Civil War take place, and Tony Stark demanded Steve return the shield because his dad made it, and Steve dropped the shield and walked away. One could argue that was returning the shield. Perhaps it's a gift, or perhaps he's recognizing that it's Stark property. In Endgame, Tony Stark returns the shield back to Steve out of concern that his daughter would start sledding with it. Old Steve gives the shield to Sam at the end. And then at the beginning of Falcon and Winter Soldier, Sam donates the shield to the Smithsonian. And that makes me wonder, was this an unconditional, or did he say this has to go to the Smithsonian? Did he have a lawyer giving him advice when this happened because of what happens at the end of the story? More on that as we get towards the end. And just thinking about the ownership issues, what's your gut reaction to the history of the shield that we see?
Yeah, so this is where part of the storyline diverged from the real comic book storyline, because there was I don't know, I'm trying to remember if there was ever in the time I was reading the comics, and I have been out of the new storyline for a while, even though I'm a dealer of Golden Age comics and Platinum Age. I like the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. I don't remember Howard Stark being involved. He certainly wasn't involved in the original Captain America in 1941 when Kirby and Simon created it for Timely Comics. And that was the only first issue where Captain America had the shield that you see in the Smithsonian that's attached to the motorcycle that's sort of shaped like that, or wherever it is. Then he gets the round shield later on. So look, we only know what we can go on from the movie. And as you said accurately, it appears that Howard Stark was a contractor for the U.S. government, and presumably then the shield was U.S. government property. If that's the case, then all of those back and forth between Steve Rogers and Tony Stark and then to Sam, they don't mean anything. This is all U.S. government property that's just being handed back and forth. Obviously, who knows what happened in the meantime, if there was any agreement between the U.S. government and any of these individuals. But I can tell you, with my legal practice, I represent a number of very high-profile auction houses that deal with comic books and historic documents. And we often get items consigned to us that turn out to have a provenance and ownership question about their origination. And a number of times I have had to negotiate the return of an item back to the U.S. government because the U.S. government claimed it was theirs, even though it had been out in the open market for decades. In fact, this happens all the time with space-related memorabilia that comes from the Apollo programs in the 60s, which the U.S. government says belongs to them, except if an astronaut. There was a special law passed a few years ago that Congress said if an astronaut from the space program says it's theirs, it's okay. But anybody else, U.S. government property, you got to return it.
I remember the space program issue coming up with somebody kept something from an Apollo moon landing mission, and things went sideways from there. This issue with Cap reminds me of the 1980s storyline that introduces John Walker as Captain America. And were you reading in the 80s? I mean, the Captain America?
Yeah, I stopped in the mid 80s when I went to college for the most part. But I mean, certainly by that time, even we were well aware. I mean, Captain America, Steve Rogers, he switched back and forth a number of times. I mean, Bucky became Cap, of course, at times. Oh gosh, what's his name? Rick Jones, who was Hulk's friend, became Bucky, and then with all sorts of new people who came in. So I mean, I remember vaguely some of that story.
I think this would have been after you stopped reading, and while my brother and I were reading. So he picked up Captain America. I picked up the Avengers. Like we had, we divided and conquered all of the different books, so we weren't buying, like two of the same thing, like one copy for each of us, type of deal. And the storyline takes place during the Reagan years, and because that's how the story will ultimately end. And the government decides, and again, it's been 35 years since I've read the story, but they basically decide, we own the identity of Captain America. We don't like what you're doing, Steve Rogers. You either do what we say or you turn over the shield and the uniform. And Steve says, I'm out. And he turns over the shield and the uniform. They then get John Walker, who got his strength enhanced from like a power broker. And I think that was the name of the outfit that gave people super strength. Things don't go well with him. There are problems with him and his sidekick. The Captain America, Steve Rogers at this point becomes the captain, which is the black uniform, and Black Panther makes a new shield for him. And so there are differences in how the new shield works versus the old one. And they ultimately crisis ensues. Serpent Society poisons the water in DC, turns into a giant snake creature, saves the day, and Cap gets the uniform back. And Walker and Cap switch uniforms. So Walker's now in the captain uniform, and he goes by the name U.S. Agent. So that's just kind of the high-level background, and I'm curious to see how much of that storyline they pull from. And with this being the 80th anniversary of Captain America, like his talking about the legacy of Captain America is important, like what the character represents, and the fact that both Falcon and Winter Soldier, are Cap at different points. So after Civil War, with Captain Steve Rogers' death, Bucky becomes Cap, and like that's part of his healing process, recovery from being used as the Winter Soldier. You then get Falcon after Steve is aged and loses the super soldier serum, and he's Cap for several years. Both were good Captain Americas, so I'm curious to see where they go. There's great source material that most of it was by Ed Brubaker, and again, great run, and really did a lot for Captain America as a character. And he broke the Bucky rule with like Bucky stays dead, and in bringing in, which I'm really glad he did, because we're here now. And then we had what I think is the best Marvel movie because of that. So with that, let's talk about Bucky getting pardoned, because we
well, and just one other thing I'll just throw in before we get to it. The issue is it goes beyond, of course, even the shield of being ownership of the U.S. government, but the name Captain America, what Captain America represents, because generally the U.S., I'm not sure if there's any exceptions, but the U.S. government doesn't copyright or trademark things that they're not allowed to generally, which is why, I could pull a congressional hearing from 1941 or from now, and I could reprint it and sell it because the government doesn't have a copyright in that item. So, but there's an interesting issue about who controls the name and the character Captain America, whether or not it's the government. That's a separate issue from a part of the shield and ownership of the shield. And so if we assume that Sam did not have the legal authority to gift it to the Smithsonian being a part of the United States government in the executive branch, that, whoever that unnamed Defense Department official was I presume it's the Secretary of Defense, because it would frankly not make sense if it was somebody lower than that, but who knows? For them then giving it to this new person is within the rights of the U.S. government. But
yeah, Bucky being pardoned. We did a mock trial about all the crimes of Bucky, and it was the first one we did. It was back in 2015 or 2016, excuse me. While we were doing it is when the news that Scalia had died happened, and it was the first time we did one of these, and it was at San Diego Comic Fest. And it was brilliant. It was a lot of fun. And somewhere one of those guys did a recording of it. It was before I got smart and started recording these. And the curator or the caretaker of like the Kirby estate was one of the guys on the jury, and I didn't know that when we had picked him. And I was like, afterwards seeing him in a panel, there was the like, holy God, neat dude. But that all of that said, like, we listed out Bucky's crimes, which are everything from insurrection to treason, air piracy, bumping off public, elected officials. Like, it's a big list of, and I made a fake NTSB report for 3 crashed helicarriers in the Potomac. Like, what's one of those babies cost? It's like the Potomac would be flammable from all the JP5 that landed in it. So, like, again, big mess. So the fact Bucky gets pardoned, says a lot, and it also raises the issue of the reference to it's a conditional pardon. So there's a lot to unpack with pardons, and so just for some definitions, and these are from some prior blog posts that we did about Guardians of the Galaxy. But a pardon does not absolve someone of guilt, but forgives them for the offense. Okay. Bucky's still not forgiving himself, but he's getting a really big mulligan for 70 years of being used by Hydra. There's another quote in the vernacular: such a pardon is an act of forgiveness, not forgetfulness. So again, which is probably why it's conditional. And you get some big due process rights if a pardon is conditional, that an executive cannot revoke it just because. There would have to be a hearing. And we have 3 rules that are talked about. And, I think we should try breaking those down. Now, you also had some notes about pardons. Now, what were your thoughts and reactions to this?
Yeah, I mean, for the one thing that people need to understand when we're talking about pardons now, and at least from the statements made by the, I presume, psychiatrist, I'm not sure if they identified what kind of doctor that she was, the way her her grammar is that he hasn't yet been pardoned. It's conditioned on him that he will be pardoned. And it could just have been the way they loosely worded it. But the way they worded it was he hasn't yet been pardoned. I think they're hanging it over his head with these 3 rules. And of course, a pardon, which many people probably watching this podcast have only just learned about because of President Trump in the last year or so, because nobody really talked about it, unless you're a wonk in politics like I am inside the Beltway type creature. Presidential pardons are only at the federal level. So if we look back to Civil War, when Tony Stark learns that it's actually Bucky, the Winter Soldier, who murdered his parents, if I remember correctly, that happened in Maryland. And that means Maryland has a parallel state criminal offense that they could prosecute Bucky for. Now, the federal pardon doesn't do anything to address that. That would have to be the governor of Maryland. So you can think about all sorts of states where Bucky, Winter Soldier, no doubt committed crimes. And in fact, the one scene that we see 2 scenes we'll talk about. The one scene where we see Winter Soldier killing people in the hotel, that's tied to he's clearly befriended the father of someone he murdered, though the father doesn't know that. That took place somewhere outside of the United States. I think it sounded like they were speaking Russian, the guys that he was killing. So whether it was Russia, who knows? But it was outside the United States. Obviously, a presidential pardon is not going to touch upon any of that criminal activity, and we clearly know Bucky would have been killing people all around the world. So then it comes back to what we were talking about earlier. Are there extradition treaties in place? Are any other countries trying to get a hold of the Winter Soldier? How is that going to come into play? Lots of things that we're never going to have addressed in the Marvel Universe because it is way too complicated.
It's such a minefield with that. And in the comic, they actually did the trial of Captain America for James Buchanan Barnes because people figured out he had been the Winter Soldier. And there was a large body count because of that. And there hadn't been a pardon, like there hadn't been a big mulligan. I would opine that if half the planet disappeared and then 5 years later, half the population returned, people might be really forgiving if you help save reality. It's like, oh, we now know your backstory. That's so horrible. We want to help you out. You're going to get a conditional pardon. Here's a psychiatrist. We're going to help you heal because you fought the Nazis in World War II and helped fight Thanos and all of his minions as well. So there could be, if I represented him, I would work really hard for state governors to also be issuing pardons as well if he had committed any crimes in those states.
Right. And that is very reasonable to assume. And we saw a glimpse of that when Sam and Lieutenant Torres were in Tunisia and the man came up to him, thanking him for saving his wife, which presumably related to, I guess she was one of the vanished and she came back. But obviously being one of the people to help save the universe is sufficient, except to get yourself a bank loan, which we'll talk about.
Yeah, there should be a big red carpet for like everyone who fought in the Battle of Upstate New York against Thanos. So like you'd think, this is what you need? Sure, we are good to go. But yes, this is just such a fascinating character study of him. And, when you think of the trauma he endured, he would, in and out of suspended animation, electric shock therapy after each mission that he had been on, and God knows what level of programming to help him with in Wakanda. Talk about trauma. And I'll send them to you. We for that mock trial we did, we had two psychiatrists or medical professionals prepare expert reports. One with, arguing for his innocence, and another for the prosecution. And like they got into it pretty detailed on what was his mental state. But him hanging out with the old man, I thought that was one of his buddies from World War II. And it took me a minute to figure out, okay, Nakajima, he killed his son.
Yeah, I was wondering at first if there was a World War II Japan America connection until it became obvious that what the
one of the
situation
guys in the first Captain America movie is of Japanese descent from Fresno, and that came out when they were Cap rescued them from the Red Skull, and thus he was one of the Howling Commandos. I thought maybe he was one of the Howling Commandos,
right,
who also would have been pushing 100. And but
sure. And one thing when you mention and it just totally escaped my. Nope, I just lost it. This is what happens when you get over 50. I keep having this thought and I lost it. It'll come back with respect to Bucky. I'll remember it.
As soon as you do, shout it out. So that's. But let's talk about Bucky taking out a U.S. senator who was a member of Hydra, and this would have made that there had been a Hydra caucus in the Senate, which is super disturbing because Gary Shandling's unnamed senator, or I don't remember that senator's name, was a member of Hydra. This second senator would have been the other senator in Hydra elected to the Senate. And you created a lot of notes for this. And I would just say she's a traitor. She's a traitor. We can prosecute her for treason. What are your thoughts on taking out a sitting senator for treason and crimes against the United States?
So this was a very interesting scene, and I imagine it was predominantly used to introduce the three rules that I have a feeling we're probably going to hear from again that govern Bucky as his conditional pardon under U.S. federal law and criminal activity. And the first thing that struck me is not necessarily a legal issue, but it was, why didn't we know about this before? Not we, that, from a storyline, but why is this woman still in the U.S. Senate, having been a Hydra pawn, which is the way Bucky described her, that he had helped put her into office and then she abused her power. And I say that because there was clearly significant amount of time that went by where you would have thought that now Bucky has been turned back to being a good guy and he would have been debriefed. And I would have thought one of the things he would have said was, oh, by the way, there's X number of senators and congressmen that are Hydra. And you might want to, take them out, or, remove them from office. But obviously that didn't happen. So what did happen? Right. He set her up in some way. We did hear her in the car threaten, conspire to murder another sitting member of Congress. Obviously, no explanation of what it was about, something like he wasn't going to vote a certain way. And if that was the case, she told whoever the guy was with her to take him out, to kill him. Now, I could understand why you would say treason. I dealt with this issue in dealing with President Trump on a number of occasions when people were saying he should be prosecuted for treason because of Russia. Actually, President Trump once publicly said I should be sued for treason when I was representing the intelligence community whistleblower. That does not exist. So sorry, President Trump. But I actually defended President Trump, and I would defend this horrible Hydra senator to say that she could not be prosecuted for treason. Treason is one of the only, I think, the only criminal crime I'm not sure if it's criminal crime, the only crime that is actually listed in the Constitution of the United States. And it has been legally interpreted over the years to have some specific requirements. And there has to be an act of war, meaning the person who is working with the other government country we have to be at war with them. Think back Benedict Arnold, which no doubt was in the minds of our founding fathers when they drafted the Constitution. Benedict Arnold, a general for the colonial forces, was actually a traitor working for the British government, fled to Britain afterwards. So that's what they had in mind, actual physical war. So people keep getting into arguments now, well, Russia and China have used cyber crimes about, cyber war. What about that? Is that an act of war? Oh, it could be an act of war for real war purposes, but for prosecution of treason, no. It doesn't fit the definition. But she could be prosecuted for conspiring to murder a sitting congressman.
I want to build upon that. So I'm pulling from my first Comic Fest material defined. That was an Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Themed presentation with Winter Soldier, and that is treason is defined as leveling war against the United States or adhering to their enemies, giving them aid or comfort. You need 2 witnesses, and it has to be of the same overt act. From the trial of Vice President Aaron Burr, the leveling war against the United States includes those who perform a part in the prosecution of the war to commit treason. This requires that a traitor perform a part of an overt act and be in league with the conspiracy. I would argue if she's been in office since before Captain America and the Winter Soldier, she had a hand in giving Hydra aid and comfort in Project Insight and getting the helicarriers built. And I bet she was on the not hit list as well. So I think there would be evidence to support treason with a deep dive into the rules of this. And for Gary Shandling, Senator, that was Senator Stern. Just look that up. So that's my reaction on why I think we could go after her for treason. But
that would make sense if you look at it from that definitional purposes. And I don't have the case sites with me, but if you do a deeper dive into the cases in the U.S. history that have interpreted treason, they have interpreted enemy as being one in which the U.S. has a declared state of war.
Okay.
And we wouldn't have a declared state of war against Hydra. It's not like the war against terrorism, which, obviously exists. The war against drugs that obviously did exist with, Ronald Reagan, Nancy Reagan.
Yeah.
Those aren't real wars. Those are concepts that we're fighting against ideology. So from a legal perspective, it would be difficult. But the reality is, when you're talking about treason, I would imagine you'd be hard pressed to figure out if someone committed an act that you would construe to be treason, that there is not an underlying criminal statute that would have been violated. Espionage, in this case with this senator conspiring to commit murder, seditious activity like we just saw at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. I represent some of the law enforcement, Capitol Police officers that were there that day. So there would still be. It's not like someone, you can't be prosecuted for treason, so they get off scot-free. No, there's
a mountain of crimes
to
get her. But I also agree with the initial analysis of Bucky would have been debriefed and would say, like, by the way, we got a couple senators who are active terrorists and fit into that neo-Nazi category of Hydras. Yeah.
You would have thought. But, the other interesting thing you look at is rules, right? The 3 rules that the first rule is he can't do anything illegal. Second rule, no one can get hurt. Third rule was to make amends. So, but let's look at the first rule. Now, obviously, he's saying he didn't do anything illegal, but I'm watching what he did, and he put a listening device on a private vehicle, which I'd have to research that more to see, because that would depend on the jurisdiction. I presume this was Washington, D.C., as to whether or not that would be legal. That would be a state local law, not a federal law. And then he took control of her vehicle, which is real. That can happen. I actually knew a journalist who died in a car crash, and there are conspiracy theories that the government, took control of his car. And like news outlets have done programs. That is a real thing because of smart cars. So that technologically, what Bucky did was totally real. Now, was it illegal? Again, I haven't researched it, but I'm going to say probably there was something that crossed the line with that. But I was more intrigued by the coincidence, and clearly they had to do this for optical effect in the program, that it looked like he was in cahoots with the law enforcement that immediately circled her when he played with her car and had her just go into a lane. I noticed particularly that the vehicles they were used are generally what federal law enforcement use, and they were completely without uniform. So they most likely were federal law enforcement. Again, if it was DC police or uniformed officers, there would have been regular cop cars most likely. So this was whether these were FBI agents, who knows, whatever they were, Secret Service. There's a number of agencies that could have been involved. But, either this was just a masterful plan by Bucky, or he was working in cahoots with the government. And if he was, then that meant they better have had a warrant to put that device on that senator's car. And there is case law as recent as just within the last couple of years that went up to the Supreme Court from here and the District of Columbia, of DC police putting a tracking device, a GPS device, on someone's car, a drug dealer's car, without a warrant, and it was thrown out as unconstitutional.
There were a couple of those in the San Francisco Bay Area as well that were, like, I think part of that, or at least related issue. He mentioned, I watched it a second time with the captions on. So that way, I like to take notes that way, just to get name spellings, and that's also how I got the Flag Smasher name, because they said it quickly the first time I watched it. There was a note about he gave information to the senator's aide, so that person could play whistleblower,
right?
Which again seems okay. That could work. That theoretically, I would have preferred Bucky being the one to turn the information over, because that would be better for a warrant, for him to be the one with the direct knowledge of her actions, as opposed to it being layered that way. But again, we don't know what he gave her, well, the aide, but that clearly was enough for federal law enforcement, to show up with some serious might to arrest a senator, which that's fun.
Yeah. I mean, obviously that whole scene, because of that one line, and I took notice of that as well. And obviously we're never going to get more details about that line. It was a gratuitous scene because she wasn't going anywhere. So it wasn't like law enforcement couldn't have swooped in on her based on whatever the aide might have said, that Bucky needed to play around with her car just to have some fun. And of course, he violated rule number 2. No one can get hurt, because I'm pretty sure the guy whose face he punched in, that hurt. Now, was he justified in doing it? Yeah, he was. The guy pointed a gun at him. Self-defense. You can definitely punch the guy back. But, depending on how strict this conditional pardon is, no one can get hurt. That guy got hurt. And I imagine the pardon, the conditions did not envision, Bucky doing this. And maybe we'll see in later episodes an inconsistency between the 3 rules. because Rule 3, making amends, was seemingly his motivating factor, and it was inconsistent
and
with Rule 2
do
and 1.
love, Rule 3, because the way he like expresses to where it's like, my name is, I am not the Winter Soldier. My name is Bucky Barnes, and the way that the tone in which he says it's like the healing, cathartic. I'm expressing regret for past actions, and that's not who I am anymore. Like I found that really fun, because it's not the angry voice. It's not the I just punched somebody voice. It's the atonement voice, and I enjoy that character development, even though if it's completely gratuitous for him to have that remote control unit. It's like, how much did that cost? Does he just have these toys? If so,
yeah, I don't think it's actually a lot of money from what I saw. If you have a laptop, literally, and the technology, you can do it. And I remembered my thoughts. So fortunately, I'm not completely suffering from any type of Alzheimer or anything. But you mentioned earlier about, in passing, the notion with Bucky of what could set him off was, these certain words that could instantly turn him back into the Winter Soldier, subject to the command of Hydra. And the movies do not explain how is Bucky this docile, whatever, to some extent docile, in control person now. And they're not going to, well, who knows, maybe they will later on. They haven't yet. There is a comic book issue that does explain it, and it was while he was in Wakanda, and it was T'Challa's sister who removed the code word issues, however one does, from his neurons in his mind, so that he's no longer controllable. There's like one issue that explains it in a couple of panels.
I figured it had to do with Wakandan science magic, at that point, for technology so advanced it looks magical. And in his days as playing farmer and relaxing as the White Wolf. So that makes sense. Good catch. Very good catch. Well, let's talk about Sam, because we have bank loan and we have his parents' fishing boat. And, you don't know this about me because you've only seen the legal geek analysis, but like I grew up as a Sea Scout and still volunteer. It's the maritime part of the Boy Scouts. So I know a little thing about boats, and seeing that fish boat made me think of a whole bunch of issues, and also the issues with, him saying like, hey, the boat's half mine, and so was our parents' house. And it sounds like his sister's named Sarah. It sounds like their father died pre-blip, and I'm going from context that the mother died post-blip. Did you get that sense as well, or not?
That's a good question. I did not pay enough attention to try and determine when the parents died. But what, of course, jumped out at me, and I know you have discussed previously, either in podcast or in writing, so I'll tee it up so you can address it. But the whole issue of, and what a massive nightmare, of all the people who vanished and died, and how their estates would have been dealt with. So, although it's probably realistic that Sam, in 5 years, the courts never would have gotten to his estate, but he probably owns nothing legally because he's dead, and everything went to his sister. But
it's fascinating, and it's funny. After I started the Legal Geeks, there's with Jessica Meterson, it was a team effort. There's a issue that I keep noticing in the law, and that's dealing with dead bodies. And so in addition to e-discovery, I know about law and dead bodies, and also some of the probate and estate issues that can come up when somebody dies. So if their mom died of natural causes after Thanos' first snap, Sam shouldn't own anything. That should all belong to his sister.
Right.
Because he was already dead. And thus the law is not designed for people to come back. That's not how the law works, because that doesn't happen. No, it's
not usually.
Like there's one case that, we have a religion centered around, but no, the law is not designed for people to come back from the dead. So if you had half the population die or literally turn to dust, the issue of what happens, because normally if you probate somebody's estate, you need a death certificate, which means you have an ME that says like, yeah, that person's dead, and all the paperwork happens. Post-snap, they didn't have that. And we can tell by the context of Endgame and Far From Home and Falcon and Winter Soldier that they simply refer to those who vanished as the vanished or the missing. So they didn't necessarily declare them dead, but the train wreck that would have happened in state courts across the country would have been a giant nightmare. Like you take places like San Francisco or LA or New York, and you have half the population disappear in a snap. That also could be half the judges too. It could also be not evenly spread out. So all the probate judges could be gone as well. The system could come to a grinding halt. And we do hear about the new world order that happened post-snap of there was chaos and governments were barely functioning, that we saw at the beginning of Endgame, that people were trying to figure out what the hell happened. If probate cases have like a 5 million% increase in courts across the country, they're not going to get to everything. And then you throw in the factor of who's left. How do you prove that they're gone? In Spider-Man Far From Home, it turned out that you had somebody who faked their own snap, that like a guy's wife disappeared, and he was a little upset about that. So again, there were people who would have exploited it as well. So I don't know if they would have just enacted laws immediately post-snap to deal with this. It could have crippled the life insurance industry.
Would have bankrupted them. I mean, there's no way. I mean, you have to, again, if you want to try and apply real world logic to a fantasy situation, you would have to imagine that the federal government, in conjunction with states, since all these probates and stuff, that's all state law, that's not federal law. Now, there may be federal tax issues, but everything is governed by the state law. That there would have had to have been legislation passed to address this issue, address the issues that, about the lack of the body and proof of death, and maybe setting statutory minimums or percentages, because there's no way that it would have been able to function at all. But it raises some fascinating issues that, again, I doubt they ever thought about. I don't know. I mean, it's not a complicated issue. If they do have lawyers on staff going through some of the writing, I'm sure somebody probably went, well, what about the estate issues? Yeah. And they probably went, oh God, there's no way.
The fact that they could figure out lists for monuments, shows that they were able to do a census of some kind for who was a victim. But
right, you saw that in the Smithsonian. I don't know if you caught it. There was a scroll of all the names of the vanished in Cap's section of the museum. I'm not sure why it was in that section of the museum. I think that's the Air and Space Museum. I'm pretty sure that is the Air and Space Museum. I'm not sure why they would have a.
Well, you also throw in that beginning of Endgame when Ant-Man comes back, and he's in what I think is Alameda. I mean, like the angles that they use, they're shooting from the Marin Headlands, which is not part of San Francisco. That's the Marin Headlands. So you're on the north side of the Golden Gate Bridge. And all the footage with Cassie makes it look like his ex-wife and second husband lived in Alameda. Again, not 100%, but just that's what the neighborhood looked like to me. And that street's deserted. Like there are abandoned cars, trash hasn't been picked up. So services aren't functioning, which made me wonder with the blip if it wasn't proportional, so that you could have had a situation that New York in Endgame looks abandoned. It looks, I Am Legend type. It's dark, all the boats and everything are rafted up, which means you could probably get an apartment for really cheap. But does that mean like Atlanta is still packed? Like that Atlanta, so they don't get into it. It doesn't have to be proportional. So like,
no, Thanos said that was the whole beauty of his idea on his planet, was that it is going to be random.
So Orange County could be intact,
but it's going to be random.
But LA gone and San Diego okay. So again, it could have been really weird that you could have ended up with abandoned cities because of that. And again,
and it struck me when in watching Endgame, that whole scene that you're talking about. I remember watching that, going, really? In 5 years, they couldn't have gotten themselves back up and running on trash? I mean, I don't know, because nobody's probably thinking, I wasn't thinking about everything else that would be impacted, and what you're talking about, the proportionality, because it did seem other things seem to be totally back to normal.
Yeah, because again, it goes to the issue of who vanished. If we lost everyone who knew how to run a nuclear reactor, we wouldn't use nuclear reactors anymore because everyone with the smarts to do it would be gone. Same with like airline pilots. I mean, so again, like what was the cut? And so again, just this big issue of society would be weird, and then everyone comes back, which again raises the issue of the flag smashers who liked things being a giant mess and everyone having the collective trauma of half the planet dying.
Yeah, and in passing, because we jumped from back in Tunisia. Well, actually, this was in, I think, Switzerland, right, where the flag smashers had this event. And then I know we got to talk about Sam too before we wrap it up with his bank loan. But I just want to jump real quickly back to the flag smashers and Lieutenant Torres, who I'm trying to figure out what the heck is this guy besides a first lieutenant, apparently in the Air Force, I think, but driving a Jeep in Tunisia. And then all of a sudden he's in Switzerland, and he's meeting with Sam. Then he's in Switzerland, and he's engaged in law enforcement, intelligence and law enforcement operations. Tries to arrest the flag smasher leader, I suppose, or whatever the title character will be for this new guy. And I'm trying to wonder what role is he playing, because he's like a hodgepodge of different characters. And does he have authorization from the host government to operate in there? And then to link us right back to Sam, when Sam goes after the bank loan, and we want to talk about the bank loan, I know, but when he's on the boat and Torres calls him or texts him, and then Sam goes to his computer to watch the video of the cell phone that Torres had. I can tell you, since I represent CIA covert case officers, if Torres had been a defense attaché or a CIA case officer or some sort of intelligence officer, that phone video would be classified, absolutely classified. So why is he sharing it with Sam, who's a contractor? Why is he sharing it with Sam, and Sam is telling him don't share it with anybody else? Where does that chain of command come into play? And why is he, presumably, we don't know, transmitting a classified video on an unsecure, regular, commercial internet line, which maybe he has a special computer with a secure line. We don't know. It's totally possible. But these were all the things going through my head as a guy who represents intelligence officers and deals with classified information. I'm like,
everything that you
no,
said.
this is not right.
I thought there was a mention about from the lieutenant. Can you get to a secure line? I thought that had been expressed in the text message.
Yeah, all right, right. He did say secure. So it could be that the computer line was secure. I think when I heard that, I initially was just thinking, can you just get to like a more secure? I wasn't thinking in that
secure
context,
line
but
would
you could be
imply
right.
his sister's not hanging out with the two boys. Like, so like that would, yeah. So like, that's not exactly secure.
Yeah.
It is totally awesome for his nephews, but it's not, they don't have top secret clearance in this story. But I also have an issue with it's just shutting down the chain of command or not reporting. Very little good comes of that in any of these stories. Like daylight is a good thing to tell people what the hell's going on. So people know we got a problem with these guys who have augmented reality hands with a globe on it, who are leaving those markers for people to organize. And like, that's one of the first times I've seen this in a story like that. And I was ecstatic to see it. But yeah, I agree with everything that you said. It's high risk, and let's hope that they bring others in. So it's not.
Right. Presumably that they will. Yeah, I was trying to figure out, like, Torres, what are you doing? And then of course he assaults. I'm pretty sure that was Switzerland, if I remember. He assaults a police officer who tries to arrest him. So okay, you don't have. Does he have diplomatic immunity?
It's just,
he's allowed to do that? I don't
again,
know.
it's the spy story thing. Like, is he on loan to the CIA? Like, what is this? And how fast and loose do they want to play with it? One level, I just kind of scratch my head, but I'm still enjoying it because it's just one guy. Like, it's not Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. bad. It's like pump the brakes. What's going on here? But let's get to the issue of trying to get a bank loan, because you think a guy who helped save the universe would be able to get a bank loan in Louisiana.
Yeah, and that was a very uncomfortable scene, and I imagine it was intended to be that way. I mean, for one thing, what didn't make sense was the notion of the bank loan officer saying, well, you don't have any income for the last 5 years. I'm like, yeah, duh. He was one of the vanished. That. You're getting it. You want to take a selfie with him. Why would he have income for the last 5 years? So that was just kind of a little, I don't know, maybe that was comedic humor to put in there. But, look, you can't escape the elephant in the room of the white bank officer and the African-American brother, sister trying to get a loan. And here he is. He's a hero. The guy's fawning over him, and they won't give him a loan, which is probably not a huge amount of money given what they wanted to do with just to fix up one fishing boat. And you got to imagine there was an undercurrent of social commentary there.
It was uncomfortable
on the race issue.
Wrong. You think because of the current world that we're just in, like our Congress passed the American Rescue Plan. You think a couple months after 3.5 billion people come back to life, and half of America comes back to life, there would be a rescue plan that would have small business loans, ways for people who've been gone for 5 years, who lost their careers, to be able to get back to work. If you want to talk, hey, it's infrastructure week, that would be a good time. because you got half the population needing to get back to work. So one would hope a responsible response would be to a build back better type solution. Yeah, you would think that it's like, no, don't worry, we're all going to suffer together. It's like, really? That's the plan here? Like, you gotta.
I mean, there are laws in the books called USERRA, which is to protect military members, that if they are called up onto active duty, or even for guard or reserve duty, that if their private employer can't just fire them. If you get called, we had so many guys, men and women, who had to go to Iraq and Afghanistan, especially National Guard, who were there for a year and a half, 2 years. And, they worked at Walmart back home. Well, Walmart can't just fire them because they've been called up onto active duty with their guard unit per law. But yet, apparently, after everyone disappears because of Thanos, none of the banks, none of the government does anything to help anybody maintain their career or get a loan. And of course, that one scene raises questions that has always been out there that few of us, probably even those us dedicated, have thought about.
That was brilliant.
Yeah, and how do these guys make money?
Like playing with the goodwill thing. And like, was he like, he had been post active duty, so I don't know if he was getting. I don't think he'd been in for 20 years, so I don't think he was. Yeah, it's just unless he was like 17 when he went in, but still, I don't think he's old enough to have been a 20-year vet. So I would have hoped Stark would have put together a trust of some kind, so people had income who were putting out their services, and we know that Tony did put down a lot of money with the Avengers compound or the Avengers Tower and the Quint jets and all that good stuff. You think people would have had an allowance of some kind so they could have made a living, as opposed to, I do DoorDash on the weekends when I'm not saving the world. Like there would have to be something, but
I'm thinking, well,
yeah.
Now there's a question, of course, we talked about the shield. There's a question of who owns the wings, which if we look back to the old movies, he had stolen them from the U.S. government. That wasn't private property. Maybe Stark made new wings. I'm not sure. Maybe I missed that. But there's issues depending on who they work for. There are laws about receiving gifts if you're a U.S. government employee or even as a contractor, and conflict of interest issues and laws that apply we have to address. But all I kept thinking when he's trying to get the bank loan is, dude, all you got to do is put Reebok on your wing, and you probably would get paid $5 million for having Reebok.
I agree.
For branding advertisement.
I think
Why don't you just do
second
that?
set of wings, because the first set is totaled at the end of Winter Soldier. So I think the second set is either Stark made or Wakandan. And I don't know which, but I don't think the government would have a claim to those wings, especially if they're different tech, entirely different tech. But it'd be fun to do a little comparison of images from all the movies to make sure that they're different, because the first set didn't have Red Wing. It didn't have an AI smart drone that we saw. Definitely in Endgame, might have been in Civil War. I'm not positive. But I agree. They shouldn't be denying him a loan. And where's like the $3 trillion bailout that has loans for small businesses and infrastructure to rebuild? Because if cities have been deserted and people are now there again, and they've been neglected for say 4 years, like they need to be maintained. Like money has to be thrown at them to clean them up so they function again. Yeah,
I imagine I guess there are 5 more episodes of this, and we'll see what else Disney Marvel does. Hopefully maybe in some of the comic line stories that come out, there'll be a greater explanation of what happened in the intervening 5 years on infrastructure, because obviously some graphic novel could take the luxury of really diving into deep with it and
I just got to say,
filling in all the gaps. But
this is a wonderful time to be a geek. For somebody who grew up reading comics. Like Friday night, no, I'm not going out. I'm watching Doctor Who. Like that's sort of this is the golden age of. We just had WandaVision. We got this. We have Loki coming out in I think June. Like then Christmas time we're going to have Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett. Like this is a really good time to be a geek. And like again, the fact that we have Godzilla versus Kong at the end of the month, dreams come true. This is fantastic, and the fact that you and we're lawyers, we get to nerd out about the stuff that we love, and use our legal degrees and experience. It's just so much fun. So.
I love it, and I got a comment on. I love the shield that you had. I sometimes collect movie props, and I'm looking to see if the actual screen use shield comes up for auction to see if I can buy it. I bid in November at an auction for Wonder Woman's magic lasso in the last film. I was the underbidder. I didn't get it. So, but hopefully one of those shields will come up for auction.
Thank you. And
that's a very
I have
cool
Mjolnir as well.
Artifact as well.
And so there's the special effects Stormbreaker that I keep looking at with a coveting eye, thinking like that would look good on the wall. Just because it's neat. It makes me happy. And I do use them in blog posts. And, this is such a rich community. Since we've started going to cons and doing podcasts with people from across the country, there's a lot of us. And it's like, who knew that reading, kids who read comics would grow up and become lawyers and judges? Like who didn't see that one coming?
Yeah, now there are a ton of lawyers who are comic book collectors. I meet and deal with them all the time as a part-time dealer, as someone who represents comic book dealers and collectors who have issues when they're defrauded, things like that. When I've gone to law schools and lectured on comic book history, there is so much interest. And look, because it starts when we're kids. I started reading comics when I was about 7 years old, at least that's my memory. I can remember at 7, and it just has stayed with me for all my life. And then I know you guys did. I watched to see how this podcast would be like. I watched your podcast on Star Trek: The Motion Picture, and I loved it. And I will tell you, I use references to Star Trek all the time in my work. It's when I'm at the Pentagon, when I'm in federal court, when I'm teaching master students on national security law. I use Star Trek references constantly because everybody understands them, and they work. They really work. That show is so light years ahead.
Especially that one
on so many different levels.
I talked about my dad at the end of that one, and the this coming Friday, the March 26th, we have a recorded WonderCon panel that will go live at 3 o'clock on with Ninth Circuit Judge John Owens, who is I love that man. He is so smart and kind, and is just a true nerd. True love of Star Trek, and like he did it from his chambers, and you got to see his different collectibles and the tie he had on that had Kirk and Spock and McCoy on it. And just just so much fun. And
Oh,
so
great.
again, that will be coming out on March 26th. And thank you. And yeah, it's just Star Trek.
All right, we'll look for it.
Star Trek's a wonderful community. Kaiju fans are a warm, loving community because I noticed that they don't always get a ton of panel content at shows. So they're happy when something comes out. And despite the fact that we're not doing anything live, I really feel good about being able to have virtual events, talk with people, and experience, see people that it would be very difficult. Love to go to DC, but not going to be doing that for a while. And just I'm sure you would love to come out to California. And
yeah, I miss going to San Diego Comic-Con. I've spoken out there 2 or 3 times. We have Awesome Con here in DC, which I believe is scheduled now for August, as I recall. I'll speak there about the history of comics. Baltimore Con, for those who are into the golden age, the old style comic book convention, because San Diego and New York Comic Cons are more pop culture than they are comics. I have a great amount of fun, but they're not Comic Cons anymore. They just have comics at them. But Baltimore Comic Con, which is usually in September or October, is one of the few remaining really good comic book shows. There's one in North Carolina that's which I know the dealer and I'm blanking on the name of it, but it's a great show too. There are still some shows that are really good, but I can't wait till we can go in person again.
And yep, exactly. There's a bright future ahead. So
keep talking.
Mark, how can people follow you on social media, or if they want to look at your comic shop? How can people look you up?
Sure. So on Twitter, Mark S. Zaid, ZAIDESQ, Esquire, Mark S. Zaid, Esquire. And then my comic book website, which really needs to be gutted and taken offline because it's so out of date, but esquirecomics.com. There's some good information up there, especially on news stories and things like that. And my New Year's goal for this year is to get that website back up to date. But I represent Hakes Auctions, which does a lot of comics, and I'm an advisor for the Overstreet Price Guide, so I'll write articles for the Overstreet Price Guide. And in fact, I'm working on an article with a lawyer for Warner Brothers DC about some of the legal issues of comic books and ash cans, which were used for trademark purposes for comics. So if you follow me on Twitter, you'll see a lot about whistleblowers and spies and also comic books.
So everyone, thank you for tuning in. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay geeky. Thank you all, and we'll see you soon. Thank you again. And
absolutely.